Magic Rings and Laser Beams is a Grimax Studio production created by sci-fi and fantasy fans for sci-fi and fantasy fans. Your host is Ben Sherman, a scriptwriter and voice talent for Fare and History, a longtime gamer and reader, and has been writing fantasy literature for the past 10 years. He's also known by his very silly username, Poohead189. In this podcast, he interviews popular authors of the science fiction and fantasy genres and speaks on writing, gaming, and movies. You can support this podcast by going to patreon.com/Poohead189. Welcome, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Hello everyone and welcome to Magic Rings and Laser Beams. Now let's make this quick, gang, because I have a great interview to show you and it's been a month in the making. I did it a month ago. And I've worked on a bunch of stuff, but I've been kind of busy with having to sell a car and buy a new one, and I've been reading quite often, which is what I need to do to continue this podcast. And but yeah, let's dive into a few things. First of all, I have started, and this is not, I know this isn't fantasy and science fiction news, but I'll get to that, believe me. But I've started to stream games, and this past Saturday was the ending of my birthday week, and by week I mean my birthday was on Wednesday, and I take the whole week off from work because it's just a vacation week and no one else wants to take off in March. So that's what I did. And I took a week off, and this past Saturday I played 7 hours of Demon's Stone, which is that 2004 PlayStation 2 game. It might have been on Xbox as well. But it's a D&D game, hack and slash, and I beat it in one sitting. I didn't think I would, and I streamed it on Twitch, and honestly, I looked like shit the entire time because I had like 20 hours of sleep in the last 4 days before I gamed it. But you know what? I had a great time anyway, and if you guys want to go check it out, you can. Right now I'm streaming Kingdoms of Amalur, which I hadn't touched in years either. But that was they're both of them, Kingdoms of Amalur and Demon's Stone, are both written by R.A. Salvatore, and you also know him as the author who created the characters for this segue into the new Dark Alliance game that's coming out this year from Wizards of the Coast, and it's featuring Drizzt, Bruenor, Wulfgar, and Catti-brie, and it's actually featuring them in their second edition forms, which is the best news I could have ever heard in my entire life when it comes to these characters, because god damn it, I miss them like that. I mean, semi-recently I reread that trilogy. Third edition is my favorite. Second edition is, and this pun is not intended, a close second. And I've just been wading through a lot of bad, well, not bad, but like, there is no bad D&D edition, but 4th edition and 5th edition are kind of slacking for me. 3rd was incredible, and 2nd edition is great. And just to have them go back to that, excellent. Great choice on their part. And I called it too, if you recall my video on the video game that I made about 2 months ago or 3 months ago or something like that. I also made another video recently because, as I said, it was recently my birthday, and I found a limited edition Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and I reviewed it in a video. It was a birthday present from me to me, and I'm staring right at it. It's such a beautiful book, written by Gary Gygax and released in 1979. So, and honestly, it's aged beautifully. Like, you should check out the review, which I'll link in the description below. but still, it's so good. And also, one more thing. This isn't exactly huge news. Well, two more things. The first thing isn't exactly huge news. However, recently I just kind of had the spotlight put on Return of Reckoning, which is a Warhammer Age of Reckoning MMO, like the MMO Warhammer Age of Reckoning. It's that in a private server that's still going on, because it shut down in 2013. But it's in a private server called Return of Reckoning. Just Google it and you will get to it. It's not hard to find. And if you feel like playing that again or playing it for the first time, I know I probably will, because I really missed that game. Really fun MMO. And also, evidently, and this might not be true, well, it's true that things have been quote-unquote said, but it might not be true that it's actually the true leaks. But Elder Scrolls 6 is apparently leaked. There's been some stuff leaked. And apparently it's in both High Rock and Hammerfell. And there's a bunch of information on it, and if you want to look it up, then go ahead. And if you haven't looked it up or heard of it, then I suggest you go do that now, but you probably have. Because there's been like 5-6 videos that I've seen on it. But yeah, that's huge news if that is truly a leak. And, well, that's about everything, I think. Yeah. Now, guys, it's time for Daniel D. Fox.
Hello everyone, today I'm speaking to Daniel D. Fox, the author and creator of the new Zweihander Grim and Perilous RPG, which won the ENnie for the category of Best Game at Gen Con 2018. Dan here exploded onto the scene of the RPG world, and we're going to have a discussion with him today and ask a few questions. So, Dan, I usually interview novelists, since I am one, and I usually ask them how they began their writing careers, but correct me if I'm wrong, but this RPG sort of came out of the blue for you. I mean, like, you worked on it for years, but you didn't really know you published it, unless I misheard from someplace else.
No, your research is correct. I think to talk about, novelists and such, I think, I was doing this when the sun went down. I had spent 16 years in advertising. That was kind of my world, digital strategy. And I had this, I think all writers or RPG creators at some point go through this. They're like, hey, I want to make my own thing because this novel that I really like has things I'd like for it to have in it that I want. Or this game that I really like playing, I wish it played a little bit differently. And that's kind of where it started for me. A lot of it was written kind of in my spare time, and it was originally intended just literally as a game for my friends and I to play around our game table, which I'm recording from right now. It was just intended for something that we would do alone, and eventually kind of blossomed into something much bigger. And if it wasn't really for the people sitting here on the game table that I've known for decades saying, hey, you need to publish this thing, it would have never saw the light of day. They really urged me to do something real with it, and I did, for lack of a better term.
Great. Now, how did you? I mean, obviously, you had the idea, you wrote everything down, and you had it all kind of together. But how did you start to do the? I don't want to say boring, but like the technical process of getting it all into an official book, getting the artist, getting the
Yeah. So that's a. I have a long answer, but the short answer is it was very difficult. And I'll preface this by saying that I had never written anything in my entire life, save for college papers. So obviously, as somebody who played RPGs for a long time, I didn't even know where to start with the design process. And when it came to the production process and how you pull people together and things like that, a lot of it I kind of pulled upon, my project management experience in digital advertising. I use a lot of that to kind of like help kind of track, progress for layout, progress for mechanics, refinement, editorial, proofing, layout. I mean, the whole kind of like the big ugly process that goes behind publishing your own RPG. I was very fortunate that we had a pretty big war chest that we had from Kickstarter we had raised, so we had a lot of the resources we needed. But our key challenge there was having to work with people between Florida, Baltimore, Serbia, which is where our artist is from. Our layout designer, she was also in Serbia. Our editor, Matthew Pook, who's in the UK, and then one of the other designers, Tanner, who lived in Florida. So it was a lot of plate spinning and ball juggling. But
Right.
given the size of the task, the size of the book, and the speed of which we brought it to publication, which after writing was finished and we had a lot of the artwork done, it took us about a year or so to really kind of complete that end to end and do fulfillment for our orders. So that's kind of like the high level. I mean, it's hard. Like, there's so many details that go into that. Like, all of the time that we took back and forth writing creative briefs for our artist in Serbia. Dejan Mandic is his name, and he did all the artwork for Zweihander end to end. So a lot of the pre-work, if you will, with the production of the book started with him. So we would write pretty extensive art briefs. English is his second language, of course. However, he understands American pop culture. So that's where a lot of the kind of tongue-in-cheek stuff comes from. It's actually driven by him. And fortunately, we're very blessed to have him on that side. With our editing process, Matthew Pook, I mentioned before, lives in the UK. He kind of took the work and reshaped it. At one point, before he had his hands on it, was around 992 pages long, which is huge. And he managed to carve it down to 672 pages, which is a phenomenal task. But a lot of that stuff we cut away. We turned into another book later on. But from production to layout to editing to just kind of fine touches. I mean, it although it took me about 5 years to write and probably about 1 year to really finish, it took us from a production perspective about a year to get out the door, to get actually into hands of initially our Kickstarter backers, and now that it's kind of at scale, it's kind of a different ballgame.
Okay. And how did you? Let's see. And you're talking to a huge Black Library fan right here. Obviously, a lot of the book. I mean, it gets it's inspiration from many things, but like you're obviously a fan of Warhammer Fantasy.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and I think that my Warhammer Fantasy experience was short. It was small. I discovered it much later on. In fact, the age was, so I'm 42. I'm turning 43 in just a week or so, and I started out playing D&D. That was like where I started around. I think I was around 11 years old. And I played D&D for so long, but I had this itch for so many years, and it was really driven by my experience with Planescape for something a little bit more mature and a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, a little bit more grim humor. And right. D&D just wasn't doing it for me. And I had written my own Kit Bash D&D thing like everybody does, in my spare time. And I was like, okay, yeah, I need to find something different. And my only experience, because I didn't go to game stores, I didn't go to conventions, I didn't really interact with other gamers, save for those I was gaming with in our basement. We had a very tight-knit group. I was actually turned on to Warhammer Fantasy when I started going to a place called Tabletop Game and Hobby in Kansas. And the gentleman who runs it, he was like, you should check out Warhammer. Like, this will fulfill what you want to do with your game. You're gaming around your home table. So I started just buying Warhammer and consuming it, and like, I went all the way back to Warhammer Fantasy Battle, all the way up to 2nd edition at that point. And I was like, I love this stuff, but I don't like the world, because I had my own game world I'd ran for many, many years. I didn't like the old world, although there were themes in it and things within it that I thought were interesting and intriguing. So when I wrote Zweihander, I cobbled that with my own game world kind of together to make what I like to call a world agnostic RPG, meaning much like how D&D has it doesn't really have an assumed world. It kind of does in loosey-goosey terms, like it has some familiar gods. But I wanted to take that same approach as Zweihander because I think my publishing goal at the time was to fill a gap in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay publishing cycle, meaning it hadn't come out with 3rd edition yet, and people were really hankering for another percentile-based system. But it also had to do something where people can take that and make it into something else they want. Like in my case, my own game world. In other people's cases, Game of Thrones, The Witcher, Black Company, Solomon Kane. I really wanted it to be able to function in that vein as well. So, although Warhammer Fantasy, the DNA is there, and the old world to some degree is certainly an influence, and Black Library and all the other wonderful things that came out of Games Workshop, much like how Pathfinder is to D&D, we sometimes like to look at Zweihander compared to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, to where although you can use it for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay if you wanted to, and people certainly do, it's better suited for other dark fantasy style stories where you can kind of create your own thing with it. And because honestly, I mean, if you're going to play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you should play 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Yeah.
If you want to play some other dark fantasy thing like Darkest Dungeons or Demon Souls or Dark Souls or something inspired by that, you can use Zweihander for it. It's kind of a toolbox in that sense. But it has some, once again, it has some familiar kind of connective tissue back to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay to where somebody could say, yeah, I recognize that. I can use this for my game. And that was its publishing intention.
Okay, yeah, because I see things like, for deities, for example, the Prince of Change and Prince of Decay, obviously, for the Chaos Gods, stuff like that. But, and some of the art, too. Like, I think I saw a Dwarf Slayer somewhere. But, or something akin to that.
Yeah.
But, I started out with D&D as well. I didn't get into Warhammer for a while. So, completely understand that. And let's see here. How would I quantify this question? You made this world, and you said it was like the Pathfinder for that, as in like sort of a, not vague, but it's sort of a catch-all kind of grim and dark universe that anyone could use for various different games. How did you, or do you, like in your game table, do you have like a codified world where you have kingdoms and royal lines and things you've codified, and then you sort of took that out and just kept all the bare information for other people to use? Or...
Yeah, in fact, so I'm going to swing my camera around real quick so you can see on our wall over here, we actually have my campaign world on the wall on a giant map. And I know that our listeners probably can't see that. But I started out there. I knew the way I always kind of played my games, for lack of a better term, as like an HBO television show. Like I grew up watching Hill Street Blues. I grew up watching a lot of non-fantasy stuff, and in fact, I would say the non-fantasy things influence the game more than fantasy. So when I think about shows like The Sopranos or The Wire or Rome, those shows like with the kind of Machiavellian intrigues, like is what really inspired my game world. And of course, over time, it kind of grew and matured. But that was its kind of foundation, was really that almost police drama style of storytelling. And I really kind of leaned into the idea of lineage as a foundational element. So a lot of players in my game have been playing for like two and a half decades. So they have characters stemming back for many, many years. And some of that world bleeds into Zweihander. In fact, in the campaign seeds, several of them originate from my own world. As an example, growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, the war of Bosnia and Herzegovina was kind of top political kind of discussion point. And because our artist, Dayan, he literally lived in like the middle of the genocide, we took from my own game world a campaign scene called Gothmore and Divided, which is basically between these two countries, Gulistan and Valstania, and we use that as one of those campaign scenes to kind of show off like what you could do with the game. And it had, once again, it kind of reached into what was already in my gaming background, my gaming DNA. But also it felt like a kind of a nod to Dayan, because he had lived during that time. He had a lot of interesting stories to share about that, knowing that he was literally a war refugee. Like he was literally a refugee living in Serbia he fled the war twice because he was displaced. But beyond that, that campaign seed's kind of somewhat influenced by that, and another one called Gangs of Cahabro, which is kind of like based off the old movie from the 70s, The Warriors.
Right.
That's been a city that, because we do a lot of urban-based games, my own home game has taken place there many, many times. So that kind of 27-year history of my own game world exists to some degree in Zweihander, but I didn't want it to be. I didn't want to directly imply it because I wanted to ensure that the Dark Fantasy Toolbox set, or as we kind of call it, the Grim and Perilous way, was still intact. It still didn't feel like, oh, well, if I play Zweihander, I have to play this game world. Instead, it says, here's some examples of things you could do, like our Roanoke Divided campaign scene, which talks about taking Zweihander and playing it in the new world in Roanoke. Or play something more medieval and traditional, which we kind of leaned into with a few of the other campaign seeds. So we had to kind of walk a very delicate balance, right? To say, here's what you can do with it versus here's what you should use it for. So a lot of gaming rule sets obviously lean into world, and we instead lean into what we call themes. Because if we're a world agnostic game, we have to prop the game up in some way. There has to be something that a person can go to and say, this is the cornerstone of Zweihander. In this case, it's dark fantasy, humanocentrism, fractured fairy tales, corruption is everywhere, both physical and traditional Warhammer chaotic, but really leaning into the low fantasy, dark fantasy aspect was important. So those kind of pillars of play, as we kind of call them, those Grim and Perilous themes, were important to us. And even though my game world is like that, just inherently, we really had to be careful about not including all of the game world stuff in it, because while we do intend to, eventually publish my home campaign world at some point. Okay. But with Zweihander, we had to be very, very careful because we didn't want there to be an implied game world at all. And I think we achieved that. It feels like we did, because a lot of people are using it for some really funny stuff. Like, we've seen people using it for their Darkest Dungeon mod. We've seen people using it for The Witcher still, despite the fact The Witcher RPG came out. And don't get me wrong, the Artels lore people are fantastic. They're all wonderful people. And we have a mutual respect for one another, considering the fact that we both buy each other's books. But people still use it for The Witcher, and they use it for other dark fantasy properties that just don't have an RPG tied to it. And that's pretty fantastic. I mean, I'm looking here on my shelf, like Joe Abercrombie. Like, that guy's like dark, gritty fantasy. Like, people use Zweihander for setting set in his world. So it's even though it has that, once again, that kind of like that this ties back to my own home game world, we really keep it kind of open-ended for people to do what they want with it.
Honestly, as someone who writes himself, that's something that I look for when it comes to source books and stuff like that, because honestly, like, when you come with the D&D 5e, various adventure modules, stuff like that, like Storm King's Thunder and different things like that, it's really neat, but you need to be ingrained in the world. And while I am, it's sort of like, it doesn't let you be the storyteller, kind of. It's sort of, it is the story itself. But let's get into the book itself. It's really big and thick, and it's honestly a good thing. I really like that. And it has a lot of directly useful information, but there's also a lot of alternative ways to play the game. Or at least there's a lot of variety to the rules that you can use when you play. Like, I think there was 2 or 3 different ways that you could aid another or add advantage to someone when they're trying to do something, or there was various ways to keep track of chaos, corruption, and certain things. Why did you go for the more varied approach rather than kind of a hard, straight rule set?
Yeah, so I think that one of the when I look back in retrospect, because it's hard to say at the time, like, this was the direction I was going. Like, it's kind of all in retrospect at this point, because it started out as like a homebrew thing, and it certainly became more honed over time, more narrow, more sharp. The design principles, like, when I look back, I can say one of the key features was modularity. Like, we really wanted there to be a toolbox approach, and I think that to really key in on that, and this is really kind of a comment about general games, is that when you put options in front of players, and instead of burying them in the game master section, you end up with kind of a a confusing conundrum on the part of players, like which rules do we adhere to, which don't we? So I feel that when it comes to optional rules, in this case for Zweihander, we purposefully put them in the game mastery section because we wanted game masters to decide, do we use this rule or not? Good examples of that are social intrigue, chase scenes, wilderness travel, social, and you basically put the power in the hands of the game master, because not every game master wants to have like a social intrigue play out or wants to make like a really cool narrative story for travel. They just want to say, okay, you get from here to there, spend 14 days, spend 14 days worth of food.
Right.
So we put those options in the game mastery section because we felt that was probably better suited to them to make that choice and to propose to the players. So when we look at really about optional content, and this is an approach we'll continue to employ as we produce more and more games powered by Zweihander, is that optional content will always be in the hands of the game master. Now that being said, caveat this by simply saying that rule zero always applies, but when we say rule zero, we don't say ignore rules. We say work with your players to change them together so you can house rule them as a team, not just a game master house rule something in a vacuum. So we really, even though we put the optional rules in the back of the book, we want the game master to work with the players to, using rule zero, to say, let's shape the house rule together, as opposed to myself as the game master making the choice because it's my game, my rules, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the kind of caveat I would say when it comes to optional rules.
All right, that makes sense. There was also something that I've heard and that I see all throughout the book, which is there's a lot of, how would I put it? There's plenty of description for a lot of things, such as right now I'm looking at motivations and shows absolution and ascendancy, and it shows a description of the term itself. And honestly, I would say that I would prefer that because, I mean, as a DM myself, if I could help my players find ways to give them motives, and then I could read that and then tell them this is what it means. That's good.
Right.
But why would you? I mean, like you said, it was 900 pages before you before you put it down to close to 700. Like, why did you decide to? I mean, you wrote so many. Like you said, you didn't exactly plan for everything, but you had a lot to describe. Why'd you go for the more I guess descriptive approach? Because a lot of games try to be bare bones. Like, let's get the most money out for the least work kind of thing.
First off, that's a very good observation, and I think that to answer that question, I have to kind of go back to Dungeons and Dragons for just a moment. Now, Gary Gygax was known for his long, flowery 25-cent, nickel word, 25-cent words here and there, very descriptive, evocative, flowery text, which in some cases felt super pedantic. In other cases, it was like, oh, this gives me context behind what the game designer's intention is. So when I thought about specifically alignments, like to say that if you tell somebody, hey, your character's motivation's absolution, like someone's going to be like, okay, well, I know what the word means, but what's it actually mean in the context of the game?
Yeah.
So when we came to alignments in particular, we decided, okay, some of these terms are straightforward, like heroism and martyrdom. Got it, makes sense. But others are a little more difficult to wrap your head around. So we couldn't just simply say, okay, pick and choose the words that are most common, those are most uncommon, and explain what they are. Instead, we said, don't describe what the words mean, but provide context behind how you would actualize this thing in the game of Zweihander. So absolution is an example. It doesn't say, here's what absolution is. It says, here's how it plays out in the game if you're this character. So I felt very strongly about that. Now, it isn't necessarily to assume that our readership is dumb, because I think that the game makes a lot of assumptions about its readers in the sense that, like, they're mature enough to absorb the material without being like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, and like, raising pitchforks and torches because they disagree with some sort of approach in it. But we want to ensure that the terminology and the words that we use, because words are important, that they have not just a definition, but an explanation of how they would be realized in the game through that lens. So that explains kind of why we did that with alignments. And there are other places too. Like I think somebody sent this to me as like I think it's a 4chan post or something like that. They're like this. They explained what bonfires or candles or something like that were. And I was like, yeah, those things are important, because important in the sense that like I'm going to explain to you what a bonfire is, but I'm going to tell you what it means in the context for how it's seen, what it can be used for, what its distances and maybe shadows, things like that. So it felt necessary. Plus, when it came to weapons in particular, this is where we started getting kind of really tongue-in-cheek, because we didn't want to just create a weapon list and say, a glaive Guise arm does this. Like, we wanted to provide some kind of clever, funny jokes around it, because one thing that Zweihander certainly is that it is chock full of pop culture references, because that's obviously it's of pop culture. And two, it needed to be funny, because I think that, and this is just a general comment about dark fantasy, like you can't take it too seriously. I think that you have to punctuate those dark moments with grim humor. I think that's what makes dark fantasy, in particular Warhammer in this case, or in some cases, are intriguing. And it felt Zweihander needed that as well. So what I didn't want to do is to create just another dark fantasy game, because that's already been done. Like we have a multitude of dark fantasy games that take themselves super seriously, and some are really fantastic games, and some are really terrible games. But Zweihander had to do something different. It plays in the dark fantasy area, but it unburdens itself by some of the baggage tied around that by taking a very different approach. And I think that it's hard to find that sort of kind of like grim humor approach in commercial games. It's really tough, because now you've got responsibility not only as a game designer to your audience, but now you get responsibility to the publishing company as a whole, and this and this and that just kind of goes on and on and on. So the latitude that some modern games may be given to be funny is severely limited. Now there's certainly exceptions to that. I think the Rick and Morty D&D box set's an example of it.
Yeah.
But for dark fantasy, there isn't. Like, dark fantasy is like traditionally tied to a very certain type of individual, and we knew, not only because we believe this, but because our own game table and designers and writers are from multi-ethnical backgrounds and in different gender orientation. We wanted to ensure that the writing was inclusive, because what we don't want to do is create a gated community of only dark fantasy fans. I mean, traditionally, dark fantasy fans, at least historically, were older white men, but the people playing the game are not. So we know we wanted to ensure that we wouldn't bar anyone from playing the game through our words, and so we had to be very cognizant of that to ensure that we were inclusive enough. So even though it does have those dark fantasy themes, we still wanted to make something that was not simply saying like, hey, this game is for us and nobody else. Instead, we wanted to say, this game is ours, we made it, why don't you come join us, see what you think. And that's kind of where I think that some of the, I wouldn't call it bloat, but the exhaustiveness of the writing really stems from.
Okay, because and speaking of when you said weapons, I think you had something that looked like a halberd on there, but said like pole cleaver or something like that, which I thought was kind of funny. Various little aspects of that throughout the book. Let me see. The artist, had they done any previous works on role playing games? Like, how did you find out about? I forgot his name. I apologize.
No worries. So yes, that's a great question. So his name's Dejan Mandic, and it's spelled like Dejan, and his last name looks like it'd be pronounced Mandic, but it's not. But Dejan, so when I started doing this kind of as a goof game in my basement, I started publishing some of the rules to a website called Strike to Stun. At the time, Strike to Stun was kind of the go-to for Warhammer. It was the kind of, a lot of sort of Warpstone started and a lot of other kind of smaller fanzines. And I started publishing some of the rules. I was like, hey, I'm making this house rule thing. People really liked it. And then Dan reached out one day and he said, hey, I've been making some fan art of your game. And I'm like, oh, cool, let me see. You never know what's going to come up. And I didn't have any expectations anyhow. Yeah. But when he produced, the very first image he produced, and I'm not sure if you have Zweihander in hand, but the very first image he produced was the image that's used for the appendix. It's the picture, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's the picture of the woman with like a burning torch and all these people burning around her, this Inquisitor. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Like, this is really cool. And I'm like, so I started kind of digging in. I was like, hey man, are you an illustrator? He's like, well, no, I'm teaching art design at University of Serbia in Belgrade at the time. And I was like, hey, if I ever do something serious, I'd love to pay you to do some artwork. So we had a back and forth for about 6 months, and he made a few pieces of art just for our home game. And I was like, hey, Deanne, I think I'm actually going to turn this into a real book. The people I'm gaming with, my buddies, they're all like, hey, you should produce this. So Dan worked for the next 2 years on 456 images in the book. He illustrated everything cover to cover. Some of it was pulled from his sketchbook from previous illustrations that he polished up. A lot of the illustrations, I'd say probably 400 plus, were all net new. So it kind of gave the book a very kind of coherent artistic feel. Like the creative design there really kind of embedded you in the world. It wasn't like a specific design vision for what we wanted to communicate to the players of the game. And that kind of goes back to what we spoke about earlier about inclusivity, is that one thing I feel that a lot of Dark Fantasy games have done is they say, okay, here's your character and here's what they look like in the game world. Instead, we kind of flipped that on its ear. We said, all right, what if instead of saying, because it has no game world, it's a world agnostic game. So what if instead we said, let's put the players around the table in the armor and clothing and garb and attire of the characters in the world. So that's where you start to see a lot of traditional gender role reversal, where you felt like powerful women as warriors and weak men in some cases. So you start to see a lot of different skin tones, a lot of asexual characters. And that was something that came from both Dan and myself. Dan he's probably 46, I think, and he has a very different, he has a very different perspective than we all do, because he grew up in the middle of a war. Yeah. And to him, the kind of things that we quibble about, about, is this really why is there women in my game, and why are there black people in my European fantasy world? To him, it's not a big deal, and to me, it wasn't a big deal either. So I was like, let's actually put the people we want to play the game in the armor, in the attire, in the clothing, of the weapons, of the characters in the world, and that really seemed to stick well with people. I think people appreciated that, and really, when I look at historically now at the Dark Fantasy genre, it's one of the very first kind of commercial tabletop RPGs in the Dark Fantasy genre to do it, because most Dark Fantasy games were really geared toward
European based and
very, because the purview, their view is that this is European fantasy. There weren't any women or people of color in Europe at the time, which is wrong, but that's the traditional view. So we were like, it doesn't matter, because this is not a European fantasy. It's a Eurocentric game, sure, but it's not based in Europe. You can be based anywhere you want. So we really wanted to say, let's represent everybody who we want to play this game in the clothing, in the armor, in the garment. I can't reiterate that enough, how important that was for us and why it helps Zweihander stand out from other Dark Fantasy games, because it says that let's toss aside the tropes and let's focus on what's relevant for today, that reflects our values as a company, as a creative outfit at the time, now a company. We wanted to represent that, and that's kind of where the art direction came from. And he went to school, so to speak, and did all this work. In fact, every year, Europeans go on, or in his case too, in the Balkan region, they go on vacation in August. So what he does every August is he leaves school, he goes to his cabin he bought with his Zweihander money, as he calls it. Because the American dollar spends very well in Serbia, coincidentally.
Yeah, that's what I heard, yeah.
So he bought a cabin, and he goes to his Zweihander cabin, and he grows what he calls his Zweihander beard, a month of growth, and he works on artwork for the game. And he works, obviously in between there as well, like nights and stuff like that. But that's kind of what he does. And it's great because we've had a very coherent aesthetic for the books across Zweihander and Mongosh, our player's handbook. when you pick up a book from Zweihander, there's no mistaking that it's a Zweihander book, even if the cover's on it, because you can see the art and say, yeah, this is Zweihander. It has the big chunky borders, like the chunky like medieval manuscript borders. It has all the artwork done in pencil, no digital drawings whatsoever, all in pencil by Dan Mandich. The only other art we have in there that's not Dan Mandich is the cover art. In the case of Player's Handbook, it was done by Jussi Alaharo, who had done RPG work previously. He's in Finland, and then he also did the artwork for our Player's Handbook. And then Mongosh, which was released about mid to late last year, the cover was done by Ken Duquette, and he's here in the United States, and a lot of his artwork is featured on our Magic cards and our Game Master screens and such.
Okay. And when you mentioned that he was still working, or every year he goes there and he works on the art now. I mean, even though he works on it regularly anyway, like, does that mean that you are now working on more things as well? Like, there's more to come down the line that currently being worked on?
Yeah. So what ends up happening? This is kind of the story of how Zweihander kind of blew up, so to speak. So in 2018. I submitted Zweihander on a whim to the Ennies. I'd never been to Gen Con. I didn't really knew too much about the Ennies, but I knew they were important. Yeah. And I never, like I said, never been to a game convention. So we submit the book kind of randomly, and like at this point, I'm literally working my standard, 55-hour-a-week job in digital advertising. A lot of travel, a lot of client-facing stuff. And I was like, I'm just going to submit this on a whim and see what happens. So it gets nominated for Best Game and Product of the Year, and I'm like, all right. I guess we have to get a Gen Con. So my buddy and Adam and I, we get a ridiculously expensive hotel a month before the show. Yeah. We drive there from Kansas City out to Indianapolis, and we win. We win Best Game and Product of the Year. We're like, how is this even remotely possible?
Yeah.
But then we look back at the audience size, and we recognize that at the time, this is 2018, we had 48,000 people playing the game. We noticed because that's how many copies we sold on Drive-Thru RPG. And we had also moved, I think at the time, around 32,000 hardback books on our own. So it was kind of this weird phenom, and then the wave just kind of kept rising and rising and rising. So turn to 2019, this leads to a conversation with a publisher in Kansas City called Anders McMeel. Now, most people don't know much about Anders McMeel, but they basically own the syndicated comic space. So Doonesbury, Boondocks, Nancy, all these like comic strips. That was their bailiwick, and they've been moving into poetry as well with Rumi Kapoor, and they also published Matthew Emmons' The Oatmeal, like Exploding Kittens, that guy. So I get introduced to them through a family friend, and it leads to a conversation. They're like, "Hey, we want to publish your game," and I'm like, "Do you publish RPGs?" They're like, "We don't." So I'm like, "Cool, let's sign an author-publisher deal." So I think they realized fairly quickly after I signed the publisher deal, because at this point I'm just like, hey, I'm going to make a little bit extra scratch off this and maybe get my books in Barnes & Noble. They kind of come to realize that they need to stand up an RPG unit because they recognize the opportunity. So they make me an offer, and I discuss with my wife for a good week or so, should I leave a 16-year career in advertising? I was on an executive path there. I was about 1 year away. I was already a senior director, and I was like, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. So Anders McMeel says, hey, well, we want to make you the executive creative director of games, specifically RPG. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. Because I figure the iron is hot now. Zweihander's success is kind of lightning in a bottle. And the signs were kind of pointing to, I need to do this, because if I don't do it, I'll never do it, for one.
Yeah.
And two, Zweihander will be a flash of the pan. It'll go away in 2 years. So, especially in light of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition coming out. So, 9 months ago, almost to the day, I accepted the offer and started Anders McMeel. And now we've got an RPG unit. So, it's myself kind of in the driver's seat. We have layout, editors, proofers, all the people who were freelancing previously for my own Growing Perilous Studios, my own little LLC. They still work on Zweihander-related products. They're still freelancers who are now paid by Anders McMeel. They're not full-time employees, not uncommon for RPG publishers. But we're taking a very different approach. I think that most RPG publishers are focused on paper word models. We're not. Our focus is on paying RPG writers as if they were novelist-publisher relationships. So a novelist will make a pitch, we will accept it, deny it, make an offer, pay royalty, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of our approach to how we want to change the game. We don't want to work on a pay-per-word model. We want to work on a pitch-based model, which seems to be working for us. In the pipeline right now, we've got Colonial Gothic, which is a supernatural horror that takes place during the American Revolutionary War that comes out in 2021. We have a pretty big IP we haven't announced yet from a very well-known Hollywood franchise director.
Wow.
We'll be announcing that here, I think, in May, I want to say.
Yeah, don't be now. Don't worry.
Yeah, but we've got a lot in the pipeline. We've got we got a 3-year plan we've put in place. We have new titles that are going to be coming out this year. We have a pretty large community content program that exists at DriveThruRPG, kind of like the Dungeon Masters Guild, called the Grow and Perilous Library. People are creating content there. There's like 118 submissions. Like there's, I think, 32 adventures there now. So it's growing, and not like height-wise, because that's where you fail, right? If you start trying to stack blocks on top of one another, instead we want to say, let's establish a very foundation first. Let's lay the foundation and make it broad and stand up several pillars along that. So those pillars we see as extensions to Zweihander. So games powered by the Zweihander D100 game system. So similar to how like Forged in the Dark approach takes. So games Forged in the Dark based off of the Band of Blades and games like that. But we control the license, so we kind of pick and choose what authors we want to work with. Work on a traditional relationship between novelist and publisher model, and let them drive the creation using the game engine. And we're only 9 months in, which is not a long time for business building. But now that it's in 2020, some of our big initiatives are launching organized play. That's going to be a big one. We have several sponsored actual plays happening right now. One is with Encounter Roleplay. One is with Adam Coble. We have another big one that's coming in summer. We're going to announce, I think, probably toward July. But we're growing, which is good. And in the business, we just looked at numbers for 2019. The business looks really, really good. And that's really kind of based on not only just the fact that Zweihander seems to be a good RPG, people like it, but to the production perspective. Andrews McMeel has been around for 50 years, so they understand the publisher model. They understand how to make things move. They understand how to print books well, high quality, because we print only collector's grade books. That's one way we also distinguish ourselves from other RPG creation companies. But
that's good.
We have book placement everywhere. I mean, I can walk on my local Barnes and Noble, like go in there every 2 weeks and sign copies and put it back on the shelf. So the Zweihander books are available practically everywhere. I mean, you buy it at Walmart. It's weird. Target, Walmart, and it has to do with the fact that Andrews McMeel has that traditional publisher distributor mindset. They have those deep relationships, so it's allowed us to get a lot of traction very quickly. In the beauty, I think, of RPGs in general is that a game can come out and then be discovered 6 months later, then suddenly blow up. Even though Zweihander, its first, the first core rulebook came out in 2018, the revised core rulebook, which came out in late 2019, is showing
that's what I have.
Sales. Yeah, sales trajectory is looking higher than when I initially was selling it on my own. So we know we're doing something good. We know people really like it, and I think it'll continue growing because we believe in the product. I mean, I obviously am the creator, but we're doing things different, and I think that is why we've been able to succeed so quickly in the last 9 months, and that will continue to grow and change over the next 3 years or until 2022, and we begin to reevaluate our business plan and make adjustments based on sales.
Okay. And so essentially, so you have various different locations to where you have people coming in and doing sort of DM's Guild-esque sort of so creating adventures like that. That's really neat. I didn't even know that, actually.
we're really lucky. You know, Drive Through RPG has been instrumental to my personal success with this when I was still just a guy doing it at night. And they continue to be a great partner for Andrews McMeel because we do have that Dungeon Masters Guild like program, the Community Content Library, and we have an incredibly active Discord where creators get together. So people are creating things and actively working together. It's not happening like they're not making things on their own and releasing it. And the good thing about the Grim Perilous Library, unlike the DM's Guild, is that it's not flooded with product yet. So when somebody makes an adventure, they can make a real revenue impact on their bottom line. They can be like, oh my God, I sold like 70 copies like in the last week. And it's phenomenal because even though we have a much smaller audience than D&D, there is a real hunger among the people who are reading Zweihander for adventures. So those who make adventures and other supplements are doing really well with it and continue to create stuff too. What we tend to find with the people who are participating in the Grim Perilous Library is that they're making multiple products. And because we give them all the art packs, all the end design templates, our own internal house style guides, including adventure style guide and house style guide for how to basically write the Zweihander way. We give that to our creators because we want them to be successful. And this is where we also are different. As opposed to giving 50% revenue, we give 60%, which nobody else in the community content program does. We also offer print-on-demand options too, which only Dungeon Master, only DM's Guild does, and they do it on a very limited basis. Yes. So we offer that like wholesale baseline to all of our creators. Like, even if the adventure isn't great, like if you want to sell it in print-on-demand, cool, we'll help you make it happen because we really want to see people flourish and be able to basically help. We don't want to raise everybody else up with us, right? I'm a big believer in a rising tide rises all ships, that we should all succeed together. That's how we grow as a brand.
Yes.
So when I look at the Grim Perilous Library, I want to provide as many tools and as many paths to success for creators because these are people who are not yet comfortable enough to make their own RPGs, or maybe they're making their own RPGs but not seeing a lot of success with it. We want to share our content back with them and say, hey, we've done all the hard work. Here, write your own thing, and we'll save you the time and trouble having to get artwork and layout and all that stuff. Use ours, use it, make something, and it's been good. I mean, it's been really good. We've got when you look at the OSR category specifically on Drive RPG, we dominate the top 23 spots. It's crazy for community content. So we know it's working. We know people like it. We know it was working with folks. And I hope, as time goes on, that we can use that Grim Perilous Library to identify new writers, identify budding creators to say, hey, you want to create something for Zweihander in an official capacity, let's have a conversation just like a novelist and a traditional publisher would have. Because that's really, in my mind, the ultimate goal is to be able to find, kind of use the Grim Perilous Library as a proving ground and find really good writers and pay them to write something official. That's like the dream, right? For any novelist or game designer, to be identified by creators and say, let's make something real. So that's kind of our story. It's we're a big believer in putting people first, putting the audience first, and it's worked for us. It's worked.
Great. And one more question. Did and you said that you're working on various things right now for the future, and you have you said eventually you're going to make a source book for the world that you've created. Is that one of the ones you're working on right now? Or...
Yeah. So we've actually been play testing it for over a year. It's called Queen of Embers. Yeah. So we've been recording our game sessions. It's called Queen of Embers.
Oh, Queen of Embers.
I think we're 67 game sessions in. We started on 12/12/2018. Just because we record every time somebody gets reward points in Zweihander, we log it with the date. We've been playing for a year, and my intention is to develop as opposed to saying here's a campaign box set, is to create something of similar scope as Curse of Strahd or Descent into Avernus, meaning it's a self-contained world, self-contained campaign that takes you from In the case of Zweihander, basic tier to advanced tier, basically the entire life path of a Zweihander character. Plus, it gives you new professions, a game world, things that are useful for players and for game masters. So we're creating that still now. My intention was to publish it in 2020, but the reality is that it's not done. We're like in Act 7 of 8, and based on the decisions the players will make, that will basically kind of finalize the development of it. It's mostly written, but as they make decisions, I change what's in the book because I want that to shape the story. So that's probably a 2021 thing as well. But that will be my kind of first like legit official my home campaign world existing in publication end to end, and I think people are going to like it. The Queen of Embers campaign in particular, because we don't want to overwhelm people with like a bunch of game world background. That's what I didn't want to do, because I mean, frankly, there's so much scope behind 27 years of gameplay that I've kept in, on an active Wikipedia now. Yeah, the active Wikipedia is over 4,700 pages. And that's transcribed from notes over the years. So we just completed this task like late last year. So I know I don't want to be like, here is a giant game world for you to consume. Instead, I wanted to say, here's a hyper-focused area within that game world that you can play in. Kind of like the Curse of Strahd plays in Barovia. But we know there's a larger world beyond Barovia. So we want to suggest the same thing in our game, which is there's a larger world beyond what you're reading in Queen of Embers, and we're going to kind of create breadcrumbs to that throughout the entire story to intrigue people. And hopefully, if sales look good, because it always boils down to book sales, if sales look good, we'll make something else that are also based on my game world. But for now, I'm going to continue playing my weekly Wednesday night game, and even if we don't publish it, we'll continue playing it, and I'll be perfectly happy with that as well.
Awesome. And actually, I know that I said that was one more question, but there was something that I also noticed that the Zweihander book is very, very, as we've discussed already, open-ended. But the last part of the book that has the two adventures, the adventures are very linear. Were you doing that as sort of a starter adventure for people to get the hang of the game, and then later they could sort of have like open-worlded variety after that, or was it sort of just too little free? Like, here you go. We're gonna give the customer two little adventures just to help you kick it off, or and will your next source book be very linear as well?
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning that. So one thing we want to do in all of our books is include an adventure. I feel that providing game mechanics without context, same way we think about alignments, we want to provide context how you can realize those game mechanics. So we created adventures at the end of Zweihander, which I think is a 42-page adventure called A Bitter Harvest, and in Manga, which I think is 35 pages. It's called There's Something About Marie. What we wanted to do, our intention was to teach game masters and teach players how to play the game. In fact, if you read through the adventure, it's super remedial in the sense that it trains you as a game master to use the game mechanics in a certain context. But if I was to take a step back and say, how are these games shaped? They are linear in the same sense that a story diamond is constructed, right? So we start at a very small hyper-focused point, and the options widen, like a small enclosed sandbox, and then we come to a sharp point at the very end. So like it always drives towards an ending. So I think that the intention was to ensure that game masters were able to teach the mechanics to players, but to open up that kind of that power of choice toward the midpoint of the story, so that would drive toward our conclusion that they made. If we look at A Bitter Harvest as an example, there are within the story we literally talk about how this game play tested differently for every group. In fact, I think there are 7 different outcomes that were written into the story because that's what we experienced. So we wanted to ensure that we gave enough to basically kind of hook players, hook game masters, to teach them in a remedial sense how the mechanics work, but also to give them the power of choice so they can determine how the ending happens. So when I look at Queen of Embers, different story. Queen of Embers assumes a certain maturity with the Zweihander game system, because at this point people who play Zweihander have had it for at least a year and a half. Some people who bought it recently, probably maybe half a year. But kind of our diehard fans have been playing it for at least a year and a half. So Queen of Embers is more, it's like a story diamond before, but each act, there are 8 acts, it's a story diamond. It starts out super sharp. You start at this point, then your options widen, and it leads to a series of conclusions that informs the future acts. So I think what you'll find, to use a sandbox style approach, is probably the best way to think about it. Although it's a controlled sandbox. A great example of that is if you look at Skyrim, right? So Skyrim as the model. Right. Skyrim is completely open, and you can go do whatever you want. When I first started playing Skyrim, I conquered the first dragon, and I went chasing butterflies. I fell into geometry in the river. I ended up halfway across the map, and I spent the next 138 hours doing anything but the main story. So that's the model. That's the sandbox model. When I think about a controlled sandbox, I think about Witcher 2. Witcher 2 has these, you have different chapters, and you have an area you can explore that's huge and wide and massive and make any different choices, but it ultimately ends in 2 to 3 outcomes. It's the same thing for Queen of Embers. Each act is self-enclosed. They can be played on their own. They have the power choice built into them. But Queen of Embers, I think that the story, the way that the controlled sandbox works on that at least, is that it's a conspiracy. And the players are tasked or charged with kind of unraveling it. So there are in-story reasons in which will eventually forge player motivations to drive them toward the end of the story. And the way that it's resolved is entirely up to them. The same thing within the story diamonds we constructed within each act, the 8 acts of the story. There are many different outcomes, but they're all generally leading to kind of the same place. But player choice will ultimately and should always determine what the end of the story is, because in my mind, it's really about the journey, right? The end part's important, sure, but not as important as the journey. So I think that as long as we make that journey open-ended and give players the power of choice, that will be where we succeed. So I think when you look at Queen of Embers, will be a very, very different approach than we took with A Bitter Harvest and There's Something About Marie, if only because there's 375 pages of adventure there. It's huge. I love the old style of D&D modules, but I didn't want to create a bunch of mini adventures. I wanted to have it just be one big thick play Zweihander end to end with this book. Right. And that's what Queen of Embers will do. We anticipate in our home game about 84 game sessions based on just kind of the way our players are, the way we kind of interact and role play and the choices they make. I think it's going to be about 84, 85 game sessions. We'll probably play this until the middle or end of summer because we play every week. But once that's all done, that's when I get to polish everything up and talk to Dan about doing artwork and get it published, which will probably be 2021.
Gotcha. Well, that is all the questions I have for today. Thank you so much for showing up because honestly, I've been a fan of Zweihander for a while. I recently got it for Christmas, but I've been picking up in bookstores often and reading it. So
that's awesome. I'm glad to hear. And I'm really happy you had me on. I know I'm really happy we had the opportunity to do this, even though it's kind of late at night for both of us. But I certainly appreciate you taking time out of your evening to speak with me. It's always humbling and strange to do interviews. I don't know if you've probably heard this. I don't know if you heard this before, but at the end of the day, I'm literally sitting in my game. I know you can see it on the camera, but yeah, I'm just sitting in the basement where I made a silly elf game, for lack of a better term, and I think it's intriguing and really cool that we can monetize our hobbies. I wouldn't have thought in any world or possibility when I was a kid that I'd be writing games like Gary Gygax, or Dave Arneson. You thought that, but now the great thing about RPGs is that the barrier to entry is so low. Anyone can make a game. You can make a game, put it on itch. You can go make a game and raise money on Kickstarter for Zine Quest. You can make a game and release it on DriveThruRPG, and people will buy it and play it and talk about it. It's so cool that we have this opportunity now at this time where we have access to funding through Kickstarter. We have people who give us pledges money on itch and Patreon. That we've got all these amazing resources like DriveThruRPG and Print on Demand at Lulu. All these amazing resources that we as kind of RPG fans can utilize. And I think that when I look at this, even though like my role has changed over the years and I left my career to do this full time. At the end of the day, I'm still just the guy getting together with his friends on Wednesday nights, playing the silly elf game that I made just for us. And it's anytime somebody tells me they're like, I've been playing the game, but looking at the game or reading the game, it's just always super humbling. So thank you so much for having me on. This is really cool.
Hey, no problem. I appreciate it. And yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on. And everyone, this has been Daniel D. Fox.